Welcome to the 300th episode of the Book Binge. I'm your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and today it's been over 4 years of this series on the channel. I've been doing the Book Binge for over 4 years, and that in and of itself was pretty insane to me, and I wanted to do something special for the 300th episode of the series. Now, I had a couple of ideas for this video that largely fell through and will have to happen later, so this video is not necessarily as special, quote-unquote, as it was going to be, but I still wanted to do some kind of topic, some kind of video that would stand out in some sense on the channel here. So I'm going to do a little bit more of the KC Canon, the King Crusoe canon, so to speak. But this time, instead of telling you what some of my favorite stuff are from whatever, like my favorite books or whatever, we're actually going to go over some of my favorites that I've talked about over the years on the channel. Basically everything that I've listed as a favorite book of the month or a book of the year this year. You know, I noticed that I haven't really addressed books of the month in my book of the year videos, for example, over any of my time doing any of this stuff. And I was also curious to just take a look at what my books of the month and years looked like over previous years in the first place, especially like in 2022 and 2023, where some of that stuff is kind of started to leave my brain a little bit. So today I wanted to address a lot of that. I wanted to address both of those topics, and I just want to overall analyze what my favorite books I've read since I started reading again in late 2021 look like and see how much they hold up. So to begin this video, I do want to talk a little bit about what the structure of this thing is going to look like, because boy, it's probably going to be a mess, but let's just give this a shot. I'm basically going to go year by year, 2021, then 22, all the way up through 2025. Basically, I'll list all of my books of the month in order, January through December. I'll determine which of those picks I think hold up in hindsight, and if I think that one of those picks is inaccurate at this point for one reason or another, what would I replace it with, or something along those lines. And then, once I've gone through all the books of the month, I will look at the associated book of the year list over the course of the entire year. I'll look at how many of my books of the year actually came directly from my books of the month. You know, sort of by percentage, but I'm not actually doing any percentage markers here. And it is important to note that I did not actually reference any of my book of the month lists when composing my books of the year in any given year, so that's kind of a thought experiment to see like how much of that actually held up in that sense. And then once I've looked over my books of the month and the year for each year in that way, I'll again determine which selections I agree with being on the book of the year list, and then mention some of the books from each year that I think might have been snubbed, some things that I might have mentioned somewhere else instead, some maybe changes that looking back on it, I would have or should have done differently looking at some of those lists. Like I said, I'll follow that structure for every year from 2021 through 2025, so that is 5 years worth of lists to look through, even though 2021 is pretty simple because, you know, I wasn't actually making content in 2021. I didn't start BookTube until 2022. But in either case, I'll do all of that. And then I believe at the very end, I'm going to look at all of this in accordance with the first KC Canon episode that I posted in 2025 with regard to my top 15 favorite books, and kind of do that same thing. Look at some of those picks that I think hold up now that it's been not quite a year, but a little while since then. I've read a few more books since then, what some things are that I might change or might be willing to look at and change at this point. So those kinds of things. But because that is a lot of books to talk about, a lot of material to get through, this is going to be a very long video. Let's just jump in and try to do this as efficiently as possible. I apologize for how long this is going to be, but it is something that I thought would be interesting to talk about, and so I plan to do so. Starting off with the rebuild year. This is 2021, the year when I started to come out of a multi-year long reading slump. Now, to be fair, from the years of, I want to say probably 2018 through 2021, I did read at least a couple of books each summer, mostly over the time of doing some camping trips with family and stuff like that. There were a few books that I would read here and there from a couple of particular authors that I was enjoying at the time. But overall, I would consider that period of time a general reading slump period, and I don't really consider anything that I read at that time, and even a couple of the books that I read in 2021, I don't really consider part of my active modern reading identity for various different reasons. I'm also just now realizing I forgot to turn my lava lamps back on, so I'm going to do that here in just a second. But yeah, so 2021 is the rebuild year. I only have technically books of the month for September through December, and I only have a top 5 list for the year. Now, the technicality with regard to the books of the month for 2021 is that I didn't actually pick any books of the month. Like I said, I wasn't actually starting doing BookTube until January of 2022, so none of these are what I picked at the time, but looking at the lists of what I read in those months, I'm 99% certain that the books that I have retroactively picked as my book of the month, those months hold up. So, there's a little bit of technicality. I read The Wrath of Darth Maul in September out of a couple books that I read. This would have been my book of the month because it's one of my favorite books of all time. And so I think that that pick would hold up if I had picked it that year. The Hobbit would definitely have been my book of the month in October. It was my favorite book that I read that month. The Fellowship of the Ring likely would have been my book of the month for November. And The Shining would have been my book of the month for December. Now, like I said, I technically did not pick books of the month for those 4 months, but I can be pretty confident that those are the picks that I would have picked at the time. They are certainly the picks that I would have picked now. So in that sense, they kind of hold up. And, looking back at it retroactively, they do hold up. But, that is a good bit of technicality going on there. I understand that. So we'll just consider that there's a big asterisk there. But that means that we're going to take a look at what my book of the year list actually for 2021 looked like. There were only 5 picks plus 1 honorable mention. Which of these do I think hold up? Well, I put The Shining at number 1. Fellowship of the Ring at number 2, Salem's Lot at number 3, The Hobbit at number 4, The Two Towers at number 5, and then I had the honorable mention being The Wrath of Darth Maul. So, 3 of the main 5 books did come from what would likely have been the books of the month that year. So that's actually a pretty solid looking list that way. But I also didn't really read very much in 2021 in the first place, so I had pretty little to choose from. That's why there's 2 Tolkien in there. 3 Tolkien, actually, technically speaking. Fellowship of the Ring, Two Towers, and The Hobbit. And that's also why there's 2 Stephen King in there alongside the 3 Tolkien. What would I do differently about my top 5 list of 2021, however? Well, I would be more willing to have given The Wrath of Darth Maul the technical spot just so that 2 authors weren't dominating the top 5 entirely. So I do feel like I technically snubbed The Wrath of Darth Maul in this way. I at least should have replaced either Salem's Lot or The Two Towers with this. And then another book that I read in 2021 that I do kind of wish I had mentioned in that book of the year list was Endurance, Shackleton's Incredible Voyage by Alfred Lansing, a book that I enjoyed a good bit and that has remained in my memory ever since then. Really, really solid book, really great nonfiction story about the first voyage to and back from Antarctica, basically. And the fact that nobody died on this expedition being some crazy miracle feat. Just really great book. I enjoyed it a lot. So realistically, if I was doing my top 5 of 2021 again, I very likely would have included these 2 on it instead of Salem's Lot and The Two Towers, probably. And then, I would have allowed for both The Hobbit and Fellowship of the Ring to be included in that list, even though they're same author. But yeah, I probably should have been a little bit more open about 2021 in that regard to make the top 5 a little bit more diverse than it ended up being. So I do think that it is interesting that all 4 of those books of the month were mentioned in some degree: Shining, Fellowship of the Ring, Hobbit, and Wrath of Darth Maul. But Wrath of Darth Maul only being an honorable mention kind of hurts my soul a little bit. So that is what 2021 looks like. Let's jump into 2022. Now, there's a lot about reflecting upon my year 2022, the first year of my doing BookTube, that is really interesting to me. There's a lot about this experience that I do actually remember, but there's some interesting choices in here that I am a little bit less certain about for one reason or another. So let's definitely talk about those. So, my books of the month for 2022 include Return of the King and The Gunslinger for January. I do recall commenting on both of these being relative book of the month quality. I do not agree with my including The Gunslinger in that list anymore. I do really like The Gunslinger. It was mostly my surprise with it at the time that led me to include it in the list. But as far as my main book of the month in January, Return of the King, I do still agree with this pick as a whole, actually. So we'll go ahead and keep that one in there. My book of the month in February was Frankenstein, which I think absolutely holds up. My book of the month in March was Percy Jackson and the Olympians Book 5, The Last Olympian. Although I did include at the time, I also said that the first half of The Wastelands would have been my book of the month because I didn't love the back half as much as the first half. But at this point, I'm willing to say in hindsight that despite my qualms with the ending and the fact that Wastelands ends in the middle of its climax, between these two, picking Last Olympian as my full book of the month as opposed to The Wastelands when the first half of The Wastelands was as good as it was, I don't agree with that pick anymore. I would say that I don't agree with The Last Olympian still being in my book of the month. I would agree with The Wastelands actually being my book of the month. So that's a little bit of a weird technicality there. For all intents and purposes, I do still think both of them hold up. Just the weight that I would have put on them at this point in hindsight is a little bit different. My book of the month in April was Wizard and Glass, which I absolutely still agree with. My book of the month in May was Wolves of the Kala, which again, I still agree with. I think that pick holds up. My book of the month in June was Song of Susanna, but this one was by default. I did not get through any other books in June of 2022, and even though it is by default, I do not agree with this book of the month pick. I probably should have just gone ahead and said, no, I don't really have one. And that might sound harsh on Song of Susanna. It's not a terrible book, but I had a really hard time with reading at that time. I had a little bit of a reading slump, and this book certainly wasn't helping. So calling it book of the month is just wrong in my head, because if I had read through basically any of the other books that I read in 2022, not literally any of them, but almost any of the other books I read that year, as well as this in June, this would not have been the book of the month. So it was it by default, but yeah, I was not super huge on it. So we'll say I don't agree with that pick, even though it was a default pick. My book of the month in July was The Dark Tower, and I absolutely think that pick holds up. But I also recall commenting about War and Peace as my book of the month that month, because it was when I read through Volume 4 and the epilogue, because I had been reading this through several months of 2022, and considering that I read through Volume 3 in June alongside Song of Susanna, I think I can go ahead and say, yes, I agree with War and Peace being made a book of the month pick for July, but I'm going to go ahead and consolidate that entire experience from when I started it back in like February or something and finished it in July, and retroactively say, this is my book of the month for June. It doesn't make any sense, but this is my list, these are my rules, but I will say that it generally does hold up as a book of the month pick. I just wish that it hadn't been alongside The Dark Tower in July. But, considering that I no longer have a book of the month in June, with Song of Susanna no longer being relevant in the conversation, I think I'm allowed to put that little asterisk there. But August is when things definitely get pretty interesting for me, and that is because that is when I started reading The Sun Eater, now my favorite book series of all time. I recall talking about Empire of Silence and Lesser Devil, because I read the first book and I read the first novella that month. And which one of these was book of the month? Well, technically, Empire of Silence should have been the book of the month, but I recall putting Lesser Devil as book of the month, because it was a 5 out of 5, and this was like a 4 that I rounded up to a 5. I gave it a benefit of the doubt, rounded it up to 5 because it was such a great debut, but there were aspects about the Lesser Devil that I enjoyed more. I disagree with making this distinction now. In hindsight, I should not have put The Lesser Devil as my book of the month for August 2022. I should have just gone ahead and said Empire of Silence. Now, of course, that also comes with the added bonus benefit, whatever you want to call it, of my knowing now that Empire of Silence is incredible, and having reread it a couple times, it has been better each time than it was the first time. So part of that is a little bit of that aspect of hindsight, not just looking back at my picks at the time, but also the fact that I have reread the book since then. But we'll say that no, I do not agree with The Lesser Devil being my book of the month in August. Empire of Silence should have deserved being my book of the month in August. September was also, there are several months here where I have multiple picks. September, I read both Howling Dark and the Iliad. I'm pretty sure I went ahead and picked the Iliad as my ultimate book of the month in September, but overall, I put both of them as that rank. They were both the book of the month, and I agree with both these picks still. You're still not going to find me picking and choosing between the Iliad and Howling Dark. If you made me choose one, I just wouldn't do it. It's kind of a similar thing in October, actually, with American Psycho and The Odyssey, where I love both of these books, where if you forced me to pick one of them, I don't think I could, because I love both of these books a lot for their own reasons. I enjoyed reading The Odyssey a lot more than American Psycho. I would not reread American Psycho at this point. I do not feel like I need to go through that reading experience again, whereas The Odyssey I definitely want to reread more. So there's some particular aspects of this, but I gave both of these equal weight as my book of the month in October 2022, and I agree with both of them still being my book of the month. November, my book of the month was Les Mis. Now, that is also similar to Song of Susanna by default, because I read this entire book in November, that was a crazy feat for me at the time. I can't believe I did that. If I were to reread this, I don't think I would be able to read it all in 1 month at this point. But, I really enjoyed this book. It was a default pick for book of the month, but I remember saying at the time, and I would still say it now, even if I read any of the other books that I read in 2022, the same month as this, it still would have been my book of the month pick. So, it was a default pick, but I do still agree with it. And then Demon in White was my book of the month in December, and I also agree with that. I still look back at that fondly. So, of all of these picks, out of the, 16 books or something mentioned here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18. Of the 18 books over 12 months that I selected for one reason or another, whether by technicalities or whatever, for book of the month, there were a total of 4 of those picks that I do not agree with, including one that was a default pick that I chose to replace with a different pick from a different month by a technicality. To be fair, of those no picks, even 2 of those were just kind of ones where I picked 2 books that month, where I would not agree with having picked 2 books that month anymore, where I would have only gone back and done 1 now if I were to. But yeah, that's pretty solid consistency. And mind you, when I'm saying, do I think that pick holds up, it's not just a matter of whether I still like that book enough to call it book of the month now. I actually looked at it in context of the other books that I read that month. Would I have picked something else that I read that month instead? Like what I did for August, instead of The Lesser Devil, I should have picked Empire of Silence, because I also read Empire of Silence that month. That's how these picks are being made. With regard to my book of the year list for 2022, however, there were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9 of my book of the month options ended up in the top 10, and then there were another, I believe, 2 of my book of the month options out of those 18 that ended up in the honorable mentions as well. So, like I said before, I did not go over my book of the months whenever I compose my book of the year lists. I just never did that, but still ended up with some pretty solid consistency with what carried over. It makes sense, but I'm a little bit surprised by that. So my top 10 for 2022 looked like this. Les Mis in first, Demon in White for second place, and this is the one pick on the list that I would actually disagree with, and we'll get to that a little bit later. The Iliad in third place, The Dark Tower in fourth, Frankenstein in 5th, American Psycho for number 6, War and Peace for number 7, Return of the King for number 8, The Serpent's Shadow for number 9. This is the one book in the top 10 list that did not appear in my book of the months. The Last Olympian for number 10, and then I included a few honorable mentions, which included A Howling Dark, because I had already put Demon in White there, The Odyssey, because I had already put the Iliad there, and Wizard in Glass, because I had already put The Dark Tower there. There were also a couple of other books that I put as honorable mentions, and those were The Emperor's Feast, which was an audiobook that I did, and then The Wandering Inn Volume 1, which I also did on audiobook. So of those 15 books, what of them do I agree with? Well, of the main top 10, I agree with most of the same picks. Like I said, I actually disagree with Demon in White being my number 2 pick, because looking back on it now, I would have put Howling Dark there instead and made Demon in White the honorable mention. So there is a technical slight edge of snub here, but pretty shortly after I composed those videos. You know, it only took a couple months into 2023 before I realized that I actually slightly still preferred Howling Dark over Demon in White. They're both incredible books, obviously, but because I slightly prefer Howling Dark, I do disagree with putting Demon in White in the ultimate book of the year list for that year. The other opinion of the list that I would do a little bit differently now is the fact that I included both The Serpent's Shadow and The Last Olympian in the Book of the Year list. Optimally, I ought to have left one of these out since they are the same author, and which one would have actually been in the list, I'm not 100% sure of. I do think I generally prefer The Last Olympian a little bit more in hindsight over The Serpent's Shadow. Even though I think The Serpent's Shadow is one of Riordan's best climaxes, there is one aspect of the story that is in there that is a little bit annoying or tedious for a couple of those books, and so I just slightly prefer The Last Olympian over top. And I would have replaced one of the others with a different book. So what are some snubs of my Book of the Year list? Well, I think the main one to talk about actually is, I already mentioned Howling Dark, but The Emperor's Feast. I actually probably ought to have put this in the Book of the Year list instead of one of those Riordan books. So that is a change that I would make in hindsight. And it is also worth noting that I do not believe I was doing dishonorable mentions for my 2022 Book of the Year list. So if I were to do that now, an obvious inclusion would be Tides of War, because it's the one book that to this day I have DNF'd and not finished and never returned to. So this is a dishonorable mention for the year. And I probably also, if I were doing dishonorable mentions, I probably would have included both Obscene Bird of Night and Song of Susanna in there as books that I liked in some regards, but also really disliked or was really put off in other regards, where I really liked part 1 of the Bird book, man. I really liked part 1. I hated the rest of it. And then Song of Susanna, I was so disappointed by it not having a climax that it just really put me off. So, yeah, that is what my Book of the Year for 2022 looks like. So let's move on into 2023. And now moving on into 2023, my second year of doing BookTube, we have a lot of picks that I actually agree with, generally speaking. You know, there's a lot of choices here that feel a little bit wrong, some certain things that feel like they're being snubbed, but I had good reason for making the picks that I did then, and I have good reasons for making the picks that I do now in retrospect, where a lot of it was like just quite frankly feeling like I was snubbing things because I just experienced so much good stuff all at once whenever I did. That's what 2023 was. So let's look at what my books of the month over the year were, which were 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea in January. This was a default pick. It was the only full book that I got through in January, but I would still agree with putting that in the top. Ashes of Man was my pick for February. Absolutely still agree with that. Count of Monte Cristo was my pick for March, and again, I would still agree with that. That pick holds up. The Way of Adan was my pick for April, and I think that that choice also holds up. Starting in May through the rest of the summer is when things start to get a little bit complicated because of timing reasons. It was when I changed my work schedule at my job, so I didn't realize how much it affected how simply I was able to do some of these lists at the time, but it certainly did. In May, my pick was The Eye of the World, and I would still agree with that. Next up is Robinson Crusoe, which is almost a default pick for June. It's not quite, but it was a month where I had a very difficult time picking a book of the month, and that was because between this and the one other book that I finished in June, I didn't really feel like either of them were truly book of the month worthy. So this is going to be a case kind of similar to Song of Susanna in the sense that, like, yes, it's my book of the month. It was my book of the month. I would still agree with it being my book of the month of what I read through that month, but I disagree with it in the sense that I didn't really feel like it was book of the month worthy. So there's a little bit of a technicality there. The next month in July also features a little bit of technicality in that The Great Hunt was my book of the month, and I would agree with that. But I also remember debating quite heavily with The Prophet of Adan for whether this would be the book of the month instead. But I would say I ultimately made the choice to like shout both of them out basically as book of the month. I would disagree with shouting out The Prophet of Adan as book of the month material for July, but because I did not actually read anything in August, or rather I did not finish any books in August, I have a very awkward month where there is no book of the month for August because I literally did not read enough of or finish anything to actually make one. I'm counting Prophet of Adan from July as that like sort of option for August, where I did read this in July, and I agree with this being my book of the month in July. But because I don't have a book of the month in August, I'll just go ahead and say that this is what that was effectively, kind of the same way that I decided that War and Peace was my book of the month for June 2022 in place of Song of Susanna, even though like I didn't technically read the whole thing that month, right? So you'll just have to deal with this being my list and me doing what I want, that's how things go. September was Dragon Reborn. I definitely think that pick holds up. October was a very complicated list, actually. My pick for book of the month at the time, I believe, was The Only Good Indians, was what I ultimately ended up choosing. And I actually don't agree with this pick anymore. And I think I said that At Night All Blood is Black was the other option, that these two were like the ones competing for book of the month, where I ultimately picked The Only Good Indians. And I understand why these were my selections at the time, but I actually disagree with both of these being my book of the month anymore. Night of the Mannequins is what I would pick as my book of the month now, even though I did technically get a little bit more out of or enjoy The Only Good Indians and or Annabib at the time a little bit more. Night of the Mannequins was one that I really circled back around on really heavily and enjoyed a ton in hindsight, a lot more than I actively enjoyed reading it at the time. But if I enjoyed reading it at the time anywhere near as much as I recall it in my memory now, this is actually my book of the month for October. So there's a little bit of a shakeup. November, my book of the month was Fahrenheit 451. I agree with this take because it's by default. I did not read any other books in November, or did not finish any other books in November, so I don't have anything else to compare it with, but it's good enough to be called a book of the month depending on the quality of the month. Like if I read Fahrenheit 451 in June, for example, it would have won over Robinson Crusoe, and I felt like would have deserved that, for example. But it was a default pick. And then in December, I picked both Return to Adan and No Country for Old Men for completely different reasons. No Country for Old Men, largely for surprising me and for being really impactful, and Return to Adan for just being a really great book that made me cry and emotional. And I would agree with both of these picks actually being book of the month. I'm not going to say that I disagree with one of these being included. They're both included, and I think reasonably so. In my book of the year list for 2023, however, I basically do still agree with all of the same picks that I made at the time, even though I feel bad for some of them in some regards. The top spot was Ashes of Man, Return to Adan in second. The Dragon Reborn in third. The Count of Monte Cristo, good grief, in fourth. No Country for Old Men in fifth. Gregor and the Code of Claw in sixth. This was one that, I did not end up ultimately including in my Book of the Month list, but ended up in the Book of the Year list. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea in seventh. The Lost Hero in eighth. Again, this did not appear in my Book of the Month anywhere. And then Night of the Mannequins in ninth. At Night All Blood is Black in 10th. And then I had a few honorable mentions of The Card Turner and 127 Hours, which were both like sort of technical inclusions for April alongside The Way of a Dan, where it was like, well, these are longtime favorites, and so I want to include them here, even though The Way of a Dan is my Book of the Month. But so they were even still mentioned in some regard. And The Only Good Indians was the other honorable mention. So you'll see my October pick, Only Good Indians and At Night All Blood is Black, both being usurped by Night of the Mannequins in the ranking. I would agree with basically all of these picks. The only question in my mind that I have is The Lost Hero being included there at number 8. But even that's not that big of a question mark, because looking through everything else that I read last year, I didn't feel like I had any real snubs. There were a couple in a couple of spots, but like The Dregs of Empire and Tales of the Sun Eater Volume 3 are both things that I feel a little bad about not having included in either the Book of the Month section or the Book of the Year section. But because Ashes of Man was there in the list and at the top of the list, no less, which I still agree with that pick in hindsight, including this in the list proper instead of like The Lost Hero would have been a little bit improper of me, even though I feel bad that somehow never ended up mentioned anywhere. It's kind of crazy that happened. And then, of course, my dishonorable mentions for the Book of the Year list were Wuthering Heights, a book that I enjoyed a lot while reading it and immediately afterwards for the most part outside of the ending, but ultimately came to not enjoy very much. I agree with this still being a dishonorable mention at the time. The Road by Cormac McCarthy would have been a dishonorable mention at the time, and Flush Boy by Stephen Graham Jones would have been a dishonorable mention at the time. I can't actually remember if I did dishonorable mentions for the 2023 year list, actually, come to think of it, but if I did, in hindsight, these three would have been it. I'm sure that I would have included these two for certain. Wuthering Heights might not have actually made it to a dishonorable mention for that list if it wasn't a thing that I already did. I didn't notate whether that was me doing that now or doing it back then. But those are what my dishonorable mentions for that year would have looked like anyway. But yeah, that is the end of 2023. Let's move on to 2024 now. Now, moving on into 2024, my third year of BookTube, and then immediately afterwards is where I start to see a handful of minor mistakes with regard to snubbing stuff, but a lot of that is stuff we'll talk about near the end of this video. So let's just go ahead and talk about the books of the month in 2024. Disquiet Gods was my book of the month in January. I would say that pick holds up. East of Eden was my pick for book of the month in February, and I would actually disagree with this pick now in hindsight. I think East of Eden is wonderful, but I read The Crying of Lot 49 in February, and this is the book that I feel like I probably should have actually put in that list for my favorite. Just in hindsight, I continue to like it even more. I hope I still really like it when I come to reread that in the not too distant future, but yeah, that's going to be my one maybe hot take there. I still really like East of Eden, but I think Crying of Lot 49 would actually be my book of the month February now. This is going to be the actual hot take. Project Hail Mary was my book of the month in March, but I would actually go back and say that it wasn't. Now, to be fair, I couldn't say at the time that I was proofreading The Murdered Son, the original draft of what became Empire of Silence, but between getting to experience this and how good it still was, but also the value of being able to experience the original draft of what became Empire of Silence in the context of knowing basically the entirety of Sun Eater up to that point was something that was really special, and between that and Project Hail Mary, I think I would actually go ahead and say that The Murdered Son was actually my book of the month, March 2024. April 2024 was, let's see, that is not the right book. I got the order of things mixed up a little bit here. The Fires of Heaven was my book of the month in April 2024, and I would still agree with that pick. The Sunset Limited was for May, and I would still agree with that. Basically, even though you can hardly count this as like a full book, it's only a couple of hours long. It's a screenplay, basically. It's, you know, hard to say that this is a book of the month, but you know, as far as you can say that, I definitely say that about the Sunset Limited for that month. The Long Walk was my pick for book of the month in June 2024, but I think I would actually go back on that. I still really love The Long Walk, but I listened to Light of the Jedi by Charles Soule, the first book of the High Republic series. And the first act of that, especially part 1, was so dang memorable of that book. I think that that first part in and of itself is worth book of the month. It's by itself worth reading, just kind of on its own. It's just such a good sequence. I really, really loved that. And so I'm going to go back and say in hindsight that no, Light of the Jedi is probably my book of the month for that month, you know, just because of that sequence. But July is a pretty easy yes. Passenger and Stella Maris as a combined duology would still be my book of the month, as I put it back then. Kind of a similar thing. The Failures by Benjamin Lyer in August was my book of the month. Absolutely holds up for that reason. Valor was my pick for September, and I once again still think that pick absolutely holds up. And then October, I think I did a technicality and said that Monster Volume 1 was my book of the month, even though it is pretty short. It is just one volume of manga, only, 400 pages or something like that. Get through this in a day, basically, if you wanted to. So it's hard to say that this is technically the pick as opposed to something like Witchy Eye, which between the full books that I read, this would be my pick. But Monster was actually what I listed as my book of the month that month. And I would honestly say that for volume 1, yeah, that's worth breaking the rules for in that case. November, my pick was A Canticle for Leibowitz, and I would say that pick holds up. And same thing for Pillars of the Earth, which was my book of the month in December, and I would also say that that holds up. So for the most part, all of my picks actually held up. And then moving into the top 10, 8 of my 10 top 10 picks were actually mentioned in the books of the month. So, I had a pretty solid list among those, but there were a couple options that are a little bit different. So let's look at what those are. My book of the year list in 2024 looked a little something like this. The Failures at the top, Pillars of the Earth at number 2, Disquiet Gods at number 3. Then I had the combination of The Passenger and Stella Maris at number 4. The Crying of Lot 49 at 5. Then Valor at 6. Fires of Heaven at 7. East of Eden at 8. Anna Karenina at 9. And The Blood of Olympus at number 10. Now, Anna Karenina and The Blood of Olympus were the 2 books of the actual list that were not included in any book of the month sections. I also had some honorable mentions of Infinite Jest, A Canticle for Leibowitz, which was mentioned amongst the actual list, and which I do feel like got snubbed a little bit. I might be willing to replace something like The Blood of Olympus with Canticle for Leibowitz, for example. Goodbye Eri, as a single 200-volume manga, was included in my honorable mentions, and so was The Crossing by Cormac McCarthy. It was an honorable mention because The Passenger and Stella Maris were already on the list. And I had one dishonorable mention that year, and that was Blood Meridian. So 2024 was a very solid reading year. And up to this point, I basically haven't really said or mentioned where I would actually change any orderings of items in the book of the year list. And up to this point, I don't think there is really much of anything that I would change. I mean, there are some pretty objective changes that I would make with some of the lists, but the orderings I don't think really matter as much. It's just interesting to me that for 2024, the 2 picks that weren't included in the books of the month would be the most likely to be replaced by something. So I do feel like I snubbed Canonical for Leibowitz just a tiny bit. I probably should have included that instead of Blood of Olympus, all things considered, just because those first 2 parts were so good. And then I also felt like I was snubbing a tiny bit New Spring, even though Fires of Heaven was also in the list. I should have called that an honorable mention. And then Night Shift by Stephen King, I might have also been willing to replace something like The Blood of Olympus with if I had really thought about it a little bit more. Despite a few stories not being my cup of tea, there were so many good stories in there that I felt like that would also be worth mentioning. So that's what 2024 looks like. Now time to cover the absolute disaster piece that was 2025. At last, 2025, the year that was basically the bane of my reading existence as far as BookTube has gone. What books of the month did I have over here? Well, in January, Congo was my book of the month, and in hindsight, while I do really like Congo and think it is a great book outside of the ending basically not existing for some reason, I think I would probably go ahead and go back and make a technicality and say that whichever arc of Monster it is that takes place in volumes 5 through 6 of the series is probably my actual book of the month, because wow, that arc was incredible. Red Rabbit was my book of the month in February, which is a pick that I think holds up. The White Country was my book of the month in March, and I also think that that pick holds up. The Path of Daggers was my book of the month in April, but this was by default because it was the only book that I finished or wasn't a reread of some like copy editing capacity or something along those lines that was going on, or short story related projects like that. Empire of Silence, I mean, by default has to be my book of the month for May, even though it is one of those rereads that technically shouldn't count because I spent basically the entirety of May just copy editing this book for the deluxe edition release, also for, you know, the Andorita special edition. I didn't feel like pulling out the Andorita special edition just because getting to those is a pain in the butt, and I've done that 15 times for this video already, and I'm sick of it. So we'll say that Empire of Silence technically has to be the book of the month for May of 2025, but for all intents and purposes, there wasn't a book of the month in May because that was a completely different thing. June, my book of the month I selected was Shadows Upon Time, however, and I would say that that pick holds up, but I feel bad that The Dead Zone was left out of being made a book of the month because I read it the same month as Shadows Upon Time, and by the same technicalities as I've done a couple times in this video, we'll just retroactively say that this goes to June, or sorry, this goes to May to fill that spot where there is no book of the month, even though I didn't read it in May because it's my list and I can do what I want. My book of the month in July was We Who Wrestle with God, and I would say that this pick holds up. We'll have more to say about that book here momentarily. While Darkness Gathers was my pick for August. Don Quixote was my pick for September, specifically part 2, because it was part 2 that I read in September, but I would say that, yeah, it's my pick for September. And all those picks, both of those picks I would say hold up. House of Leaves was my pick for October, and I would say that this pick for Book of the Month in October holds up as well, even though it was by default. This was the only book that I got through all the way in October. Knife of Dreams for November, and I would say that yes, that was my pick, and I would agree with it. And my pick in December, The Silmarillion, was also one that I would agree with now. Even though it's only a few months gone, I would agree with most of those 2025 picks. With regard to the book of the year, however, things get a little bit complicated, because I'm realizing now in hindsight with 2025 that I read enough books that I could have made a top 10. It would have been a little bit of a stretch, but I could have made a top 10 instead of just a top 5, like what I ultimately ended up doing, because I had a couple of honorable mentions. There was another book that I would have included an honorable mention, another one beyond that could have been a competition between a few books. That would have been pretty fun. And I also had a book that I just completely forgot to include in the book of the year list. So if nothing else, I could have made a top 7 and had a few honorable mentions, and that would have worked if nothing else. So my book of the year in 2025 looked like Shadows Upon Time in first place. In second place was Red Rabbit. Third place was The Dead Zone. Then you followed that up with The Silmarillion. And in 5th place was House of Leaves. And my couple of honorable mentions that I included for the year were While Darkness Gathers, as well as The White Country. However, like I said, I realized that I could have done things a little bit differently. If I wanted to make like a top 7 list, I could have also incorporated Congo into the honorable mentions list in there somewhere. And like Don Quixote could have maybe been mentioned. I could have had a competition between a couple of Wheel of Time books for an honorable mention or something like that. But the real problem with my book of the year 2025 is that I somehow completely forgot about We Who Wrestle with God. In my list, when I looked at my list of all the books that I read in 2025, I somehow don't have this written down for the month that I finished reading it in July, even though it was my book of the month pick that month. I just somehow completely forgot to even consider this for my book of the year list. And if I had remembered it, this would have been in the top 5. So this was definitely a snub for the year. I feel absolutely horrifically stupid that it somehow didn't end up getting mentioned or anything in there, but alas, that is the way things go. Also, it is worth noting that my dishonorable mentions of The Aeneid and Winter's Heart hold up for dishonorable mentions, but yeah, my biggest snub for 2025 was We Who Wrestle with God not being included. That is mega unfortunate for me. And now finally, as one little just brief thought experiment before we move on to the final section here, let's look at the 5th year of BookTube 2026 so far and just say that, well, things are going very well, because in January I had a dual pick for my book of the month between Hardboiled Wonderland and The End of the World and The Three Musketeers. And obviously it's only a couple months apart, but I'm going to say that yes, these picks hold up. But at the time, I would have told you that I couldn't pick between the two of them. That's why I decided to make them both Book of the Month. Now, I know that they're both Book of the Month for different reasons, but if you make me pick between the two of them, which I prefer, I'm going to say Hardboiled Wonderland and The End of the World. These make up my top 2 books of the year so far, and I would be pretty surprised if they were not both at least top 3 of the year. My book of the month in February was The Gathering Storm, and this obviously makes my 3rd book of the year up to this point. Nothing much else special to say there. I don't feel like I have any other changing thoughts or opinions about my read so far this year that usurp what that looks like, but we'll see what the rest of the year brings me. But that'll take us finally into referencing all of this material. I have no idea how long the video is at this point, way too long in any case, but it is an hour and 45 minutes long in recording because I've had to go through and grab the books and move things around and stuff after each section here, so it's a very long recording at this point. Let's look at what all of this means for my book of all time, my 2025 list that I did in May, I believe. The very end of May 2025, I composed my top 15 books, and it included 5 honorable mentions. And, well, fortunately, basically every pick that I have here was a Book of the Month pick in some regard. There are 2 of the honorable mentions that were not a Book of the Month pick, and there are 3 books in the list, 2 in the list proper and 1 more honorable mention that were not Book of the Months that I have not actually read or reread recently enough, like in the 2020s, to be able to say for sure whether they should still be in those parts of the list, but we shall see what I have to say about each of these in turn. There are a number of snubs that I have in here that I would be willing to maybe put in place over some others. So my top 15 books of all time plus 5 honorable mentions, as I said just about 10 months ago at this point in time, started off with Les Mis. Next up was Ashes of Man. And this is a pick that might end up being debatable. At this point, I don't know what my favorite book in the Sun Eater is anymore. For now, at like conventions and stuff, I have been saying that Shadows Upon Time and Ashes of Man are tied, but I need to finish rereading the series before I truly know. So Ashes of Man basically does still hold up in my top favorite list, but there is the chance that it could be taken over by a different Sun Eater book upon rereading. We shall see about that. My third place selections were the Iliad and Odyssey. That holds up. Fellowship of the Ring next up, which again also holds up a bit in my opinion. Pillars of the Earth in 5th place. I'm actually a little surprised that's not higher up, but considering the other books, I guess it makes sense. Return to Adan in 6th place, with The Failures by Benjamin Lyer in 7th place. And in hindsight, I would actually probably now be willing to switch these two, put Return to Adan in 7th and The Failures in 6th. So that's a slight change that I would make there. In 8th and 9th place are a couple books that I haven't read in the 2020s, and so probably should just not have included them in the list in the first place, but those being I'm Number 4 and then The Martian. I do plan to reread them at some point, just, I haven't gotten to that yet. The Shining was in 10th place, so that's what made up my top 10. The next 5 after that were American Psycho, and then Frankenstein, The Passenger and Stella Maris in 13th place. The Count of Monte Cristo in 14th place. And then The Wrath of Darth Maul in 15th. And this is a pick that I would probably go back on a little bit. And instead of including it in the top 15 proper, I would probably make this an honorable mention in place of something else. But, it's kind of hard to say. In either case, let's try to get some of these other books sort of out of the way of the camera frame just a little bit more so it's not as distracting. Some of my honorable mentions for that list at the time were The Dragon Reborn, The Dark Tower, The Card Turner, another book that I haven't read in the 2020s, that was Pieces of Paris. This is just one from a couple years before I started reading again. This was during my big slump, my slump of multiple years. This was one of the books that I read one of those summers. And then Infinite Jest was also an honorable mention. So what of these picks make sense? What of them hold up? Well, The Wrath of Darth Maul was an honorable mention for the year that it was mentioned in 2021, but like I said, I would go back and actually make that a technical top 5 pick in actuality. So if you include that, every book that I read in the 2020s, or every one of my favorite books that I've read in the 2020s was a book of the year option, not just a book of the month option somewhere, but a book of the year option. So again, that makes sense that those are then my favorite books. So I have some amount of consistency there. And then most of my honorable mentions were also Book of the Year options as well, funny enough. Infinite Jest was just an honorable mention its year, but The Dark Tower and The Dragon Reborn, for example, were picks like that. So what are some books from this top 15 plus 5 honorable mentions that I consider maybe potential snubs for the list? Well, Fellowship of the Ring is in the list, so considering The Hobbit a snub is a little bit unfair, but I think that War and Peace is a book that probably could have been and should have been in the list proper. It's one that I am still sad that I didn't end up including in the full list. I wish I did, but I did not. Next up, At Night, All Blood is Black is another one that's like, man, this really had potential, and maybe if I were to redo the list, I would include this in an honorable mention, maybe? I'm not sure. At this point, I'm just coming up with the idea that looking back on everything I've read, if I were to update my KC Canon, my favorite books of all time, I'd probably expand the list to 20 or maybe even 25 books. So, there's some question marks about what my list would actually look like. Would I really reorder very much about that beyond what I already told you guys? I'm not 100% sure, but if I were to redo the list, I would probably go ahead and make the rule that it has to be a book that I've read, in the back half of 2021 through present. So I Am Number 4 and The Martian would not be included in there. And I would probably just put The Wrath of Darth Maul as an honorable mention. So there's at least 3 slots open for other books. And there's, like I said, War and Peace would probably be one of those books that I'd stick in one of those slots. The biggest snub, however, that I have for my book of the year list that I didn't, or sorry, my favorite books of all time list that I didn't even really realize until several months later was The Crying of Lot 49. The fact that this is not even an honorable mention in the list is extremely confusing to me. Kind of like We Who Wrestle with God in my book of the year list. Like, looking back at it now, it's like, man, how was that not even mentioned in there? Like, how did that just get completely glossed over? Crying of Lot 49 is another one of those picks. If I were to redo my top 15 books, this would be in there somewhere. This is one that I feel extraordinarily stupid and silly for having forgotten it to even mention in that list. And furthermore, looking back on things now that it has been 10 months, even since then, despite 2025 not being a fantastic reading year, 2026 has been a fantastic reading year so far, you know, like Gathering Storm being mentioned in the Wheel of Time stuff. I technically didn't read that until 2026, so, you know, there's that. But there are a handful of other books that I have read since I composed my original favorite books of all time list that could have contention to be in the list. Things like The Silmarillion, despite Fellowship of the Ring being there and The Hobbit also being sort of halfway snub. This is one that's like, man, this is unique enough in its own right that it could very well be worth having at least as an honorable mention. House of Leaves is just so unique and dynamic and cool that this would almost certainly make the list, especially if I expanded it from 15 books to like 20 or 25. House of Leaves would absolutely be on the list at that point. It would at least be an honorable mention alongside something like Infinite Jest. We Who Wrestle with God would have a very real chance at being in that list as a nonfiction pick. Endurance by Alfred Lansing might also be something that I would possibly consider for that list if I expanded it a little bit more. Let me try to get some more of these books out of your guys' face. I'm so sorry about that. I just have a huge stack of books right here. But most importantly, this year in 2026, not only were my two favorite books of January, The Three Musketeers and Hard-Boiled Wonderland. And not only am I fairly certain that these are going to be I'm 100% certain they're both going to be in my book of the year list for 2026. They might still be in the top two spots. Something might usurp one of them, or both, as the case may be. But I am 100% certain at this point that at least Hard-Boiled Wonderland would end up in my favorite books of all time, and I'm pretty sure The Three Musketeers would as well, and would honestly probably even replace The Count of Monte Cristo. So, you know, I talk about 2025 being such a mediocre reading year for me, but 2026 has been so good so far, and the handful of books that were great in 2025 were good enough that my favorite books of all time might actually be significantly affected by all of these books. So, you know, maybe I update the KC Canon in 2026. Maybe by the end of the year, I'll have read a few extras of some things, both in terms of books, my favorite books, but also even a couple of series that I'll have either finished or read enough of to be able to potentially incorporate into favorite series. I think I might be able to redo the KC Canon at the end of 2026, only a year and a half after doing the first edition of it, just because there was enough stuff that I've read since then that is definitely having an impact on the list in hindsight. So that's something that's very interesting to me while composing this video to have learned and discovered. So if that's something you would like to see later this year, let me know. And if you have made it all the way through this absolute mess of a video, undoubtedly way too long of a video, I apologize for the quality of it if it's not great, but I appreciate you checking it out nonetheless. I hope it was some manner of enjoyable. I hope it was some manner of enlightening as well. After composing my notes, I realized that I agree with myself almost entirely as far as books of the months going into book of the year and stuff like that. Obviously, all of my favorite books of all time basically are books that I mentioned in book of the year spots in previous years. So it's like, obviously, I'm consistent enough. My opinions have actually held up enough. I don't disagree with enough of my takes for this to have really been that interesting of a video. You know, some things have changed with time, but surprisingly little of it has. But it has made me realize that there are some things that I missed, and I might make a video on those topics specifically. Maybe, maybe not. I will certainly consider updating the KC Canon for the end of 2026. However, that is something that I'm very keen on doing because, wow, yeah, there are some things that might be different. But with all that being said, thank you guys so much for watching this video one final time. I really hope it was decent despite how much of a mess it was just trying to put this together. But I'm too far into March at this point. It was a little bit too late even getting through this recording. Like, I got through an hour and a half of this 2-hour recording right now, and realized, like, this is not great. I probably shouldn't be doing this, but I committed too hard and now have no other choice but to finish it. So I hope it was worth watching. All that being said, though, I am rambling once again. I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.